The rain had started to fall, just as Jake stepped out of his old beaten-up car. He pulled his hoodie over his head, shoving his hands into the front pocket as he hurried toward the pharmacy entrance. The cold drizzle wasn't the only thing weighing on him. His mind was cluttered with thoughts. College applications, his part-time job at the diner, and the never-ending stress of making ends meet. Inside, the warm air carried the scent of antiseptic and freshly stocked shelves. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly as he joined the short line at the counter, scrolling through his phone to check his bank balance. Barely enough to get through the week, he sighed, preparing to pay for the allergy medication he needed. Just ahead of him, an elderly woman in a faded brown coat and scuffed-up shoes was speaking to the cashier. Her voice was soft, yet the weight in her tone was unmistakable. "Are you sure there's no discount? No other option?" she asked, her hands trembling as she held a small paper prescription. The cashier, a young man no older than Jake, shook his head apologetically. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Without insurance, it's going to be $84.99. The woman's shoulders slumped. She reached into her purse, fingers sifting through what little cash she had. She counted the bills, then reached for a few coins, her movements slow and reluctant. Jake watched as she sighed deeply, eyes filled with quiet defeat. Something inside him stirred. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because she reminded him of his grandmother, who used to scrape together change to buy him little birthday gifts when he was a kid. Maybe it was the exhaustion in her face, the kind that told 1,000 untold stories of struggle. Before he could overthink it, he stepped forward. "I got it," he said, pulling out his debit card. The woman turned to him, surprised. "Oh no, dear. You don't have to. I want to," Jake insisted with a small smile. "Consider it a gift." The cashier hesitated, glancing between them before swiping the card. The woman stared at Jake, eyes glistening with emotion. She shook her head in disbelief. "You're too kind," she murmured. "You didn't have to do that." Jake shrugged, trying to downplay it. "Just hope someone would do the same for me one day." The woman reached into her purse, pulling out an old crumpled piece of paper and a pen. Her hands were unsteady as she scribbled something down. Then she folded the note carefully and placed it in Jake's hand, wrapping her frail fingers around his. "Please read this when you get home," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "And never forget. Kindness has a way of coming back." Jake nodded, unsure of what to say. He watched as she clutched her medication tightly and walked toward the exit, the bell chiming softly as she disappeared into the rainy night. Later that evening, after a long shift at the diner, Jake sat on his bed, exhausted. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper. The edges were worn, the ink slightly smudged. He hesitated for a moment before unfolding it. As his eyes scanned the words, his heart began to race. What he read would change his life forever. Jake's fingers tightened around the paper as his eyes moved across the faded handwriting. The note was short, but every word carried weight. "What you did today was not just an act of kindness. It was fate. I have been waiting for a sign, and you gave me one. Please, if you are willing, meet me at Willow Park tomorrow at 4 p.m. I need to tell you something important. You have no idea how much this means." His pulse quickened. Fate? A sign? What could this woman possibly mean? He reread the note at least 5 times, searching for any hidden meaning. But the message remained just as mysterious. The next day, Jake couldn't shake the thought of the woman and her message. At school, he found himself zoning out, barely listening to lectures. Even at work, he kept checking the time, feeling an odd pull toward the park. He had no reason to go, no real obligation, but something deep inside told him he needed to be there. By the time he arrived at Willow Park, the late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows over the pavement. The park was quiet, with only a few joggers and parents with strollers passing through. He scanned the benches, heart thudding, until he spotted her. The woman sat near the fountain, her hands resting gently in her lap. She looked up as he approached, a warm but knowing smile on her face. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," she said softly. Jake sat beside her, suddenly feeling nervous. "I wasn't sure if I should, but I couldn't stop thinking about your note." She nodded as if she understood completely. "I should introduce myself properly. My name is Evelyn." Jake gave a small nod, unsure of what to say. He had so many questions. But before he could ask, she reached into her purse and pulled out an old yellowed photograph. "This was taken almost 50 years ago," she said, handing it to him. Jake hesitated before taking it, his eyes scanning the image. It was a black and white photo of a young couple, standing outside what looked like an old pharmacy. The man had his arm around the woman, and they were both smiling, really smiling, like they were the happiest people in the world. But something about the man's face made Jake pause. There was something familiar about him. "That's my husband," Evelyn continued, her voice thick with emotion. "And that's me. That day, a stranger changed our lives forever." Jake looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Evelyn took a slow, deep breath before continuing. "Many years ago, my husband and I were struggling. We were young, broke, and expecting our first child. He had just lost his job, and we could barely afford food, let alone medication he desperately needed. We had nearly given up that day at the pharmacy when a young man, about your age, stepped forward and paid for his prescription." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. "We never got to thank him properly," Evelyn went on. "But that one act of kindness saved my husband's life. He got the medication he needed, got back on his feet, and we built a beautiful life together. That stranger had no idea what he had done for us, but I never forgot him." She turned to face Jake, her eyes filled with something deep and unspoken. "Yesterday, when you did the same thing for me, I knew it wasn't just a coincidence. It was fate." Jake swallowed hard, his mind racing. The connection, the timing. It was almost too much to believe. Evelyn reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You see, Jake, kindness never disappears. It moves forward. That man's kindness reached me all those years ago, and now, through you, it has come full circle." Jake could barely speak. He had only wanted to help in a small way, to do something good for someone without expecting anything in return. But now it felt like he had stepped into something bigger, something that had started long before him. Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening. "And there's something else." Jake looked at her, his breath catching in his throat. "My husband's name," she said, pausing. It was Henry Lawson. The name hit Jake like a wave. His grandfather's name was Henry Lawson. Jake's head spun. He pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through the old photos his mom had sent him months ago. When he found the one he was looking for, his heart nearly stopped. It was him, the man in Evelyn's photograph. His grandfather had been the one who changed her life all those years ago, and now, without even knowing, Jake had done the same for her. Evelyn saw the realization on his face and smiled softly. "Your grandfather's kindness saved my family, and now, all these years later, you saved me." Jake's hands trembled as he set the phone down. He felt as though the universe had just tied a thread between the past and the present, pulling him into a story he never knew he was part of. But before he could fully process it, Evelyn reached into her purse one last time. "I want you to have something," she said, pulling out an envelope. "Inside, there's something your grandfather left behind. He would have wanted you to have it." Jake hesitated before taking it, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had no idea what was inside, but whatever it was, he knew it was about to change everything. Jake's fingers trembled as he took the envelope from Evelyn's hands. It felt heavier than it should, like it carried more than just paper, like it carried history. He swallowed hard, hesitating for a moment before finally peeling it open. Inside was a single letter, the ink slightly faded, but still clear. His grandfather's handwriting was neat, careful, like he had taken his time writing each word. "To whoever finds this." Jake's breath caught in his throat as he read. "If you are holding this letter, then you are part of something bigger than yourself. I have always believed that kindness moves in ways we can't see. Many years ago, I did something small, something I thought was just a passing moment. I helped a stranger in need. I never expected anything in return, but that moment stayed with me. It reminded me that we are all connected in ways we may never fully understand. If this letter has found you, it means that connection has come full circle." Jake's grip tightened around the paper. He felt Evelyn's eyes on him, watching, waiting. He kept reading. "Life has a way of bringing the right people together at the right time. If you are reading this, then you are meant to be here. You are part of this story now, and maybe, just maybe, it's your turn to keep it going." Jake exhaled slowly, his chest tightening with emotion. He could almost hear his grandfather's voice in the words. This wasn't just some coincidence. This was something bigger, something he couldn't explain, but he felt it deep in his bones. Evelyn placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your grandfather changed my life without even knowing it," she said softly. "And yesterday, you did the same for me. You reminded me that kindness still exists, that good people still walk this earth." Jake looked up at her, overwhelmed. "I didn't do anything special," he murmured. "But you did," she insisted. "You did exactly what your grandfather would have done. You showed kindness when no one was watching. And that changes lives." Jake sat there in silence, letting it all sink in. The weight of his grandfather's words, the reality of what had just happened. It was almost too much to wrap his head around. But as he looked at Evelyn, at the warmth in her eyes, he realized something. Maybe this was never about one small act. Maybe this was about something bigger, about the power of kindness, about the way one person's actions could ripple through time, touching lives in ways they never expected. Evelyn smiled at him, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt something shift inside him. A sense of purpose. A realization that maybe, just maybe, his grandfather had been right. Maybe kindness really did come full circle, and maybe it was his turn to keep it going.